When tales of long-time Caribbean-born UK residents suddenly being targeted for deportation started to emerge late last year, those stories barely made waves. Now, though, the Windrush Scandal has snowballed, with citizens wondering if it's all gone too far in the Britain where rising anti-immigrant sentiment led to Brexit. The Home Secretary, when the policy was decided, was called Theresa May. But it's her successor, Amber Rudd, who's now fallen on her sword. This after The Guardian exposed proof of the quotas that Rudd denied knowing. Many argue that what led to these quotas in 2015 is what led to Brexit a year later. A sharp rise over 2 decades of immigration. That rattling many citizens in the UK. Now, with Windrush, will attitudes change? The balance certainly won't change inside of a bitterly divided cabinet. Rudd's replacement, Sajid Javid, also campaigned for Britain to remain in the EU and opposes the kind of splendid isolation that would have the UK leave the customs union. That's still the PM's official position. Could a rethink be in the cards? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the Windrush Scandal and its fallout. With us from Bishop's Stortford, that's north of London, former Conservative Member of Parliament Nick Dubois, the author of Confessions of a Recovering MP. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you and good evening.
From the UK capital, John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Welcome to the show again, sir.
Good evening.
Shoshana Fine, Research Associate for the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po, whose focus is squarely on migration policy across Europe. Thank you for being with us. And Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the digital web magazine Le Monde Moderne, The Modern World. Thank you for being with us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The first one sailed in 1948 aboard the Empire Windrush. Caribbean immigrants encouraged to come to the UK to help rebuild post-war Britain. Those that would follow would be known as the Windrush generation. Today, in a nation that doesn't require ID cards like here in France, many of the 1,300 targeted for deportation have no way of proving that they've been bona fide legal residents for decades. Nicholas Rushworth explains.
Of more than 400 happy Jamaicans.
The Windrush generation is named for the ship Empire Windrush, which brought the first big group of Caribbean migrants to Britain in 1948. Commonwealth citizens were invited to help rebuild the British economy and to fill labour shortages after the Second World War. Almost 500,000 people left the West Indies between 1948 and 1972. Many did not get a British passport. They did, though, pay taxes and vote in the UK. The British Interior Ministry in 2010 destroyed landing cards with the aim of protecting their identity, a move meant to have no impact on their residency status. Yet Clayton Barnes paid a price. He went to the family home in Jamaica in 2010 and wasn't allowed back into the UK. He was told he'd been away for more than 2 years.
What do you mean? I said, what? I'm not a criminal. I work hard, pay my tax, whatever, raise my kids, have my family. And I just come out here and then, to get it back because of the job.
Theresa May, as Interior Minister in 2012, stiffened immigration checks. People had to show they were British citizens to be able to use health services. Some of the descendants of the Windrush generation were, in recent weeks, threatened with deportation. The Prime Minister has apologised, promised compensation, and said that all pre-1973 Commonwealth immigrants who do not already have British citizenship will get it.
Nick Dubois, your reaction in that report when we saw that retired roofer who was unable to return back to the UK?
Yes, I mean, it's quite disgraceful what's happened to a whole generation of people who came to the UK to help rebuild the UK and build new lives for themselves. The government have rightly apologised. It has, however, been something that has been predictable. Indeed, I had a constituent that I wrote about who faced citizen issues simply because she was unable to prove she had been here, despite the fact she came to this country when she was the age of 8 and has been a huge contributor to life in Britain. So the fact that this issue is now out in the open, and however distressing many of the stories are, it is at least now, I believe, the time that we will be able to solve the problems that those people have got who still have Generation Windrush problems, proving their right to stay. The government are clearly responding and acting quickly. However, it should never have come to this. This is not the British way. We have lacked in the Home Office fairness and humanity.
And why? Was there pressure to, keep the quotas up? Why the zeal inside of the Home Office?
Well, look, I think this whole discussion is very easily confused as two things. First of all, there were, as we now know, targets on reducing illegal immigration. In fact, politically, there doesn't seem to be much disagreement that people who are in this country illegally, the government should work to remove those people who are here illegally. But the Windrush case, of course, is nothing to do with legitimacy or illegality. It is to do with a flawed system that has failed these people because it introduced various regulations over the years that meant many people went for years without actually being recognized as being legally British. Your question to me is, has a climate in the Home Office, has pressure in the Home Office meant that staff have looked at Windrush generation people and decided because they can't prove they stay here, they have no right to be here? Clearly, there is some evidence that the culture in the Home Office, perhaps driven by targets, perhaps driven by internal targets, meant that the Windrush generation were caught up in this, shamefully caught up in this.
John Curtis, how did it come to this?
Well, it came to this because the UK, as has already been explained in 2012, 2014, said that if anybody wants to rent property, anybody who wants to employment, has to be able to prove that they have the right to reside in the UK. So either they're British citizens or they have the right of residence. The problem arises, however, because between 1948 and 1973, citizens of the then British Empire / British Commonwealth had freedom of movement to come to the UK. Many of them came, but in those days, these were the days when, for example, a child could move from one country to another on the passport of their parents. So it's in particular what the people who've been caught are people who came of usually as children who are now in their 60s and who never bothered to acquire British citizenship. They were Commonwealth citizens with permanent right of residence. They came here, when they came here in the 40s, 50s and 60s, any Commonwealth citizen could come to the UK. That right was stopped in 1973. And now, 30 years later, we introduce regulations designed to stop illegal immigration. But the problem is that as we discovered, there is this body of people, Commonwealth citizens, usually came as children on their parents' passport, never had to prove that their right to be here, that their right to be here. Now that we require people to prove their right to be here, there is a gap in the system. So in a sense, we've been trying to apply the bureaucratic standards of the 21st century to a group of people who entered the UK when bureaucratic standards were much looser. But the problem, therefore, is that essentially the UK faces is that until at least we have sorted out who are the Windrush people, and we're probably going to have to be generous in our interpretation, then actually these other measures designed to reduce illegal immigration are frankly difficult to enforce, not least because, as you rightly pointed out, we don't have a system of identity cards in the UK, and we've been using passports and driving licenses and various other forms of identification as a substitute therefore.
Shoshana Fine, you who lives in France, should there be ID cards in the UK?
I mean, Absolutely. I don't think that this is the right way forward, but I'd just like to respond a little to the comment of my co-panelist who mentioned that this policy was at first put in place to reduce illegal migration, so to speak. Now, what we can see with this policy, but with all migration policies, is that far from reducing illegal migration, they are what constitutes illegal migrants. Illegal migrants don't just exist out there, they're constituted by such very policies and practices. And so this is obviously
How so?
For instance, if we take what's going on in France right now, we've created just recently in the last weeks a new asylum law. This asylum law is making it increasingly difficult for asylum seekers to reach and access a fair system in France, therefore enabling these people to be categorised as illegal migrants rather than genuine asylum seekers and refugees. And this is exactly the same situation that we can see here. Secondly, I'd like to point out, thinking back to the story of the retired man we saw that is no longer allowed to come back to Britain. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't just apply to the Windrush generation, but Britain has imposed increasingly stringent family reunification procedures so that now families need to earn over £20,000 before they're able to join their children, husbands and wives. And this goes, quite frankly, contrary to the European Convention of Human Rights.
But can I point out, neither of those 2 points are relevant to this debate. You're quite
They're
right.
absolutely relevant.
A British citizen cannot bring somebody into the UK, a family member, unless they reach a certain income level, and that's certainly a controversial policy, but it's nothing to do with the Windrush issue. And equally, the Windrush generation are not asylum seekers. They are people who came to the UK with freedom of movement, with the right to be here. So
but they've
we
been
can
made
argue about the
un-British.
merits.
This policy has tried to...
With respect, they never were British. These are people who came to the UK as Commonwealth citizens, but back in 1948, we as a country defined Commonwealth citizens as British. The problem is we then undefined them as British in the 1970s. And in a sense, I would suggest to you the real issue here is not so much about asylum seekers or about our laws on who can come here. The real lesson of this is to do with the rights of the European Union citizens who are now in the UK, also coming to the UK with rights of freedom of movement, rights which are now about to be taken away as a result of Brexit. And the crucial lesson of this is that the UK is going to have to make sure it documents those European Union citizens who have the right to be here very, very carefully, because if it fails to do so, then it could well be the case that in 10 or 20 years down the track, those people will get caught in the same kind of bureaucratic nightmare. The point is, we had people with the right to be here. We didn't bother to document it very carefully in the 1970s when we ended the automatic right of Commonwealth citizens to come here. We've now got to make sure that that mistake is not repeated when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union.
Alexis Poulain.
I think it's all about the hostile environment that Theresa May, since she was at the Interior Ministry, has wanted to push in the UK. When she came into office in 2010, the UK...
As Home Secretary.
Yeah, as Home Secretary. The UK Border Authority decided to ditch the landing cards of these Windrush people back in the 50s and 60s, saying they were not useful archive. So they made it difficult for people to prove that they came this way. And as you say, no, the UK has to make sure that the bureaucracy is in place so that we don't have the same issue with the European citizen who wanted to come to the UK. But what if they decide again to ditch the archive and saying, oh, we don't need that anymore in 20 years, 25 years? The problem is it's about philosophy. It's the way you tackle immigration, the way you look at people and saying, oh, you got rights because you're British and you don't got rights because you're un-British. And Theresa May, remember, wanted to get out of the EU Court of Human Rights, the Human Rights Agreement. It tells a lot about the way she envisaged welcoming foreign people in the UK. And that is the key of the issue, not just Windrush, the way you treat people in your country.
Nick Dubois?
Yes, thank you. Look, I think it's really important that this issue is not conflated, as we've just heard. First of all, I think Windrush is clearly something the government, Home Office have been wrong about. They are going to move heaven and earth to change that. What I also think, and I totally agree with Professor John Curtis, that if I was an EU citizen who had been living and working here now, who has even almost reached agreement between the EU and the UK on their future rights here. I would now have doubts whether those rights could be challenged in decades to come, simply because of what we have seen, which can only be regarded as incompetence at the highest level in the Home Office.
Today it looks like incompetence, Nick Dubois, but Theresa May lasted 6 years as Home Secretary, which is a pretty remarkable achievement. Most have a much shorter shelf life. And she did it by showing that she was tough on immigration, tough on illegal immigrants.
Up to a point. Remember that the UK government had a target of trying to get net migration down to below 100,000 a year, and miserably failed under Theresa May's tenure as Home Secretary in achieving that target. One of the reasons for Brexit is the feeling that the UK government is not in control of immigration, that promises that politicians made about immigration have not been fulfilled. And again, one of the problems that faces the UK government in the wake of this scandal is that it looks like another instance whereby actually we're not able to control immigration effectively. But remember, the backdrop to this is not that the UK has been effectively rigid in controlling immigration. The backcloth to all of this is that actually the UK has been experiencing high levels of net inward migration during the last 15 years, higher than it's had ever since the flight of the Huguenots.
Nick Dubois.
Well, and the point is, it hasn't been able to cope. And that is why we've also had to respond to the British public's request, as illustrated by Brexit, that they wanted to take control of immigration. And that rightly means we have to have the processes in place to manage immigration, but also control illegal immigration. That is something that the government have got to get to grips with. That is the challenge for them. One of a good starting place, by the way, I think, though, is that they have to change the culture within the Home Office. We have to see a more humane and fairer system implemented. And if we're going to do that, I think a big step towards that, actually, is to stop to ditch this target of getting net migration down to tens of thousands, because I think that is perhaps the backdrop to what has been happening and what has driven some of the behaviour in the Home Office. Now, that does not mean you do not seek and root out illegal immigration. What it does mean is that you are in an environment where you can manage an immigration policy that works for Britain. Now, that I think is very important, because Britain should have control of its borders. That was a clear instruction of the British people. But thirdly, and I come back to what your contributor earlier said, this should not be confused either with asylum. Britain actually has a very fair and a good track record in dealing with asylum, and that should not really be entering into this debate at all.
All right, how the UK manages its border policy as it negotiates Brexit, we'll be talking about it when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on the day when the UK got a new Home Secretary in the wake of the Windrush Scandal. We're talking about it in the company of former Conservative Member of Parliament Nick Dubois, author of Confessions of a Recovering MP, who joins us from Bishop's Stortford, north of London. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to John Curtis, who teaches at the University of Strathclyde and who's in the UK capital. Here in the studio, Shoshana Fine, Research Associate at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, and Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the web magazine Le Monde Moderne, The Modern World. 1994, that was the last year when the UK had more emigrants than immigrants. Every year since 1998, in fact, those coming in have outnumbered those going out by at least 100,000. And when you look at this graph, Shoshana Fine, you see that there's a definite spike in 2004. That's the year when there's an opening up to a whole host of East European nations. And we heard John Curtis in part one of our show saying this is kind of what fueled Brexit.
I think that if we want to understand Brexit and if we want to understand the Windrush Scandal, then we need to understand the way in which migration has now become securitized. That is to say that since the mid-70s, increasingly today, we now think of migration as either a problem or a security threat. And this has become completely normalized. And this has led not only to Brexit, but has led to policies, the creation of this hostile climate, and not only pushing British citizens, doctors, teachers, to become border guards, but actually sanctioning them when they don't do so.
But do you agree a net influx of 100,000 people a year in Britain, 100,000 a year, that plays perhaps on the psyche of many people?
I think that Britain needs immigration. Britain has always been a country of immigration. Britain, like many other European countries, is an ageing society. What we often find is that immigrant groups are occupying different spaces of the labour market. Immigrants are not a threat to Britishness. We need to think about what Britishness is. Do we want a democratic, open Britain, or do we want some kind of imaginary Britain that denies all of its history as a diverse and democratic nation?
Alexis Poulain, some saying that Britain perhaps was too open. There was Britain, Ireland, and Sweden were countries that opened their doors after 2004, and other countries like Germany and France that put caveats on who could come and who couldn't.
I think because there was a need for this. The economy was booming. You had the 90s were great for the UK. You needed a lot of newcomers back in the old days. I was living in London at that time. I was a French living in London, like so many French. And London was one of the biggest French city after Bordeaux. And that was Europe. That was the cool Britannia. That's also what Europe is good about, is making people move from one country to the other. But the fact is that these people come in and goes out. I came back to France after a while, and a lot of these people that went to Britain came back to their families or had other plans or went to other countries. So you can't just close and say we're going to be a closed ecosystem. That doesn't work because the fact that the world now is interconnected. If you look at who's the Home Office, there was Amber Rudd, she was in banking, and Javid was in banking. They do a lot about moving capitals from, moving the money from country to the others. And when you're successful as a country, you're attracting a lot of investors, but not only investors, workers that want to come in and get a share of what's going on here. That's normal. The problem is, how many can you actually get in the economy without it being a problem? And that, I don't have the figures. And maybe that's why you say there was a lot of fear-mongering and a campaign about Brexit saying we don't need this. In France, we have remigration policies. We got Defend Europe. People want to protect Europe from Islam. So there is a lot of, theories, history, fake news coming on about this because of the fear that our societies are moving towards something that we don't control, which was one of the reasons of the Brexit vote. We want to go back to the old days, being between Brits living in Britain.
Can I interrupt on that point on Brexit?
Nick Dubois.
Look, I think Brexit is easily misunderstood. And let me explain why in the context of immigration. Yes, it's true. Britain voted to control its own borders. But what we're actually saying is, in a global world, we want to attract the very best from around the world. And so long as we are signed up to the 4 freedoms of the EU, we have to give priority and complete freedom of movement to the EU group of 27. And we do that to a disadvantage of others from around the world, because yes, we want to control immigration, but we want it level and equal for all those from all around the world. We intend to lead the challenge and the fight to win the best global talent, not just from Europe, but the best global talent from around the world. And we can only do that if we control our borders and we control who comes in from where.
John Curtis, how is that line going to play post-Brexit?
Well, the truth is, so far, the United Kingdom government has not given us any idea at all of what its post-Brexit immigration policy will be. But what's behind Nick Dubois' comments, of course, is that, to some degree, the argument about immigration in the UK is about which diaspora do we want to give preference to. Coming back to Windrush, in the 1940s, the 1950s and the 1960s, we said, if you're in the Commonwealth, you get priority. You have the right to come. And we then ended it, actually, ironically, when immigration got rather higher than the public were beginning to find acceptable. Then when we joined the European Union and we had freedom of movement, we then said European Union citizens should have priority. But because the United Kingdom is a country with a very large diaspora, an English-speaking diaspora as a result of its empire and what is now the Commonwealth, there is a constant debate going on inside the UK. Well, hang on, why is it that people from France and Germany can find it easier to get here than people from Australia, New Zealand, India or Pakistan? So that's part of the debate. But the second thing I think you want to understand, I think particularly to your contributors in the studio, I understand all the arguments in favour of immigration, but what you need to understand is that immigration affects different sections of society differently. If you are young, if you are a university graduate, if you speak more than one language, immigration is an opportunity. And you are somebody, yes, who has the labour market skills, that means that people will want to attract you. But if, on the other hand, you are older, and you don't have much in the way of educational qualifications, immigration is something that happens to you. People come to your town, they come to your city, and in particular in the wake of EU immigration, a lot of EU migrants went to parts of England where have not historically experienced a great deal of immigration, and the reaction, rightly or wrongly, of the older population who are not people who are themselves are ever going to take advantage of the EU freedom movement is to say, I've lost my country. So we need to understand here, freedom of movement is something that some sections of society benefit from, but other sections of society actually feel it's to their disadvantage. And unless one understands that there are real differences of cultural and economic interest in the debate of immigration, you will not understand why immigration is potentially a toxic issue, even if you think that at the end of the day in a globalized world, we have to learn to live with it. The point is, in learning to live with it, we need to understand that immigration has social consequences for certain sections of our society, which people do not find acceptable, and they have to be ameliorated and dealt with.
And that brings us to the question of what is the mindset now as the UK negotiates Brexit and negotiates its future border policy with the rest of the continent. The latest chapters, what we've seen transpire over the last 24 hours. Out with Amber Rudd as Home Secretary, in with another Remainer, Sajid Javid, who makes his move from the Housing Secretary. More on that from Selena Sykes.
An attempt to draw the line under the immigration scandal engulfing Theresa May's government. The British Prime Minister has appointed a new Home Secretary after the resignation of Amber Rudd over her handling of the Windrush Scandal. Her successor, Sajid Javid, already has a lot on his plate.
The most urgent task I have is to help those British citizens that came from the Caribbean, the so-called Windrush generation, and make sure that they are all treated with the decency and the fairness that they deserve.
The former investment banker is the UK's first Home Secretary from an ethnic minority. He appeared to set his sights on the job in comments to a Sunday newspaper, attempting to diffuse public anger, after it emerged that a generation of Caribbean migrants from the Commonwealth who came to the UK legally had been threatened with deportation. Javid, the son of a Pakistani bus driver who came to the UK in the 1960s, said he and his family could have been affected. Meanwhile, the departure of Amber Rudd has opened up the line of fire on the Prime Minister herself. She was Home Secretary for 6 years before taking on the top job, and has been accused of creating a hostile environment for migrants.
When I was Home Secretary, yes, there were targets in terms of removing people from the country who are here illegally. What we are doing is responding to the need that people see for a government to deal with illegal immigration. That's exactly what we are doing.
May has lost 4 ministers in just 6 months and is under pressure to get her house in order amid ongoing Brexit negotiations and ahead of local elections this Thursday.
John Curtis, is she weakened?
Oh, yes, I think undoubtedly she's weakened because at the end of the day, the reason why this problem has arisen, or at least the most immediate reason, is the result of a policy decision that was made while she was Home Secretary, and that indeed is the policy of saying that people have to prove their right to be in the UK before they can get a job, keep their driving lessons, etc. I mean, there is no doubt that Theresa May is in the firing line on this, and one of the reasons almost undoubtedly why the Prime Minister wished to keep Amber Rudd as her Home Secretary is that to some degree at least she was a human shield. And the truth is that, you know, having had a few relatively good weeks as Prime Minister in the way that she was seen to deal with the alleged chemical attack on the 2 Russian nationals in Salisbury, the way in which she was involved together with France in dealing with the alleged chemical attacks in Syria, I think again that she's to some degree again back on the back foot. A government that is apparently in a mess on immigration, has lost yet another minister, and where we know that this has happened at a time when the UK government is now really beginning to have to debate exactly what it wants in the negotiations, and in particular is coming under pressure domestically to accept that maybe we're going to have to, if not least to be in the European Union customs union, that maybe we're going to have to be in a pretty close customs union with the rest of the European Union. And that debate is currently going on within the UK government.
It's going on within the UK government. Nick Dubois, do you see the balance of power shifting on that crucial issue that John Curtis mentioned, which is the customs union, now that you've had this reshuffle?
Well, first of all, I think the reshuffle is interesting in the sense that she's appointed Sajid Javid, who does not hold the same views on immigration that Theresa May holds. That's a brave appointment. That's a recognition that things need to change. But whilst Sajid Javid was a Remainer, as we say, in the EU debate, he has fully embraced the Brexit arguments and the case for Brexit. And he does not, for example, as he's publicly stated, support the idea of a customs union. And frankly, the proposal on the table, which is a clone of a customs union, is unlikely to persevere, because I think the weight of the cabinet don't support the idea. It's going to be a very interesting week in politics. The last few days have been very bad for the Conservative Party. There's no question of that. But I think Sajid will deal quickly and efficiently with and rightly with the Windrush generation. And by the end of this week, after we've had local elections and the cabinet have met to discuss the customs union, I think we will start to see what exactly the relationship is going to be with Europe, because the government have to reach agreement very soon.
Alexis Poulain, it'll be straightforward, no customs union sets, because that's the official line right now.
That's the official line, but you see there's so many fronts open at the same time. The negotiation is very hard with Michel Barnier and with the EU as a whole. I can't see, and of course there'll be the local election in the coming days. That would be another test of, you know, where the Tories sit now. I see it very difficult for Theresa May to concentrate on Brexit while she has so much to do on the internal front, not to name the Irish border that's going to come up, the custom unions, of course, and what else with this Windrush lying, you know, constant lying of this. It looks like very amateurish, very unprepared, and I can't see Brexit happening in a nice and soft way, as it is, you know, said on TV networks and saying, oh yeah, we got a plan and we're going to stick to the plan. Negotiation will be hard and might get even harder given the internal situation of Theresa May within her party.
Do you agree the new Home Secretary is going to do what it takes to put the Windrush scandal behind us?
I think I'm doubtful, but what we can say is that the Windrush scandal is more than a scandal just for the Windrush generation, yes. Right? It really reveals a lot on the kind of climate we're living in Britain today. Just if you take immigration policy alone. So we've created, you know, Theresa May purposefully created a climate and environment of hostility, which creates tensions, which has led us to a divided society and essentially a divided Europe.
Yeah, just like I mean, you
but the
talk
evidence
about those
doesn't
who got
support
from
that.
the fact that people are winning and people are losing. It's what's happening in Hungary with Orban is exactly the same. We had the Front National in France, and you have Theresa May in the UK. It's all about playing with this story of immigration to get elected and play with fears. And I don't think it is. Actually, the problem is just a political will. Get the money. Don't ditch the NHS. Make sure that you can get these people working. The fear is only to protect a few, the 1% that want to keep their bonuses in the Cayman office or the Bahamas. But for the people who want to have a job, have a life in the UK, it's going to get very, very difficult. And there's no reason for this.
Nick Dubois?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to challenge the idea about the climate in the UK. It's absolutely right. The government encouraged this hostile environment in the Home Office. But I was only looking at a Eurobarometer survey that was taken last week, when actually, when you look at Britain, when you look at Germany and France and Sweden, that over 50% of Britons regard multiculturalism and integration as a success. And that compares dramatically with only about a quarter in Germany and Sweden, for example. I think what the British, and I then take issue with the second point that's been made, that it's going to get harder, and I think I heard this said, harder for immigrants to work in the UK. No, when we control our borders, we're going to be reaching out globally as well as in Europe to encourage people to come to work in Britain. The difficulty is we have to have the system in place that will make sure we are treating people fairly. And when they do come here and they have the right to work here, there's no doubt about it.
John Curtis, the night after the Brexit vote, the day after a sleepless night, I remember speaking with you outside the UK House of Commons. You were reflecting on how polarized Britain had become. What's the situation like nearly 2 years later?
Oh, Britain is still polarised.
More?
Britain is still
Less?
Just as much. I mean, it is polarised between one half of the country that voted to leave and one half that voted to remain, and that split is still there. But crucially, underneath that 50-50 split, you've got a situation where the vast majority of younger people, the vast majority of university graduates voted to remain, but conversely, a very clear majority of older people, a clear majority of those with little way of educational qualifications. Well, you may talk about lies, but the truth is that it's quite clear that untruths, or at least debatable statements, were made by both sides. For example, yes, we can argue about... Well, can I point out to you that you can quite reasonably criticise the Leave campaign, but equally the Remain campaign told us that the economy was going to go into recession in the immediate wake of a Brexit vote, and that's been shown to be wrong too. We can argue about the merits of both of those campaigns. The one thing that isn't a lie, right? We can argue about its merits and advantages and disadvantages, but what you do need to understand is that a country, the UK, which actually historically has tended to be a net exporter of population for the last 15, 20 years or so, has experienced relatively high levels of net inward migration, not least, ironically, has already been pointed out, because back in 2004, we decided to be more liberal about immigration from the then EU accession countries than virtually any other country in Europe. So keen were we to embrace the Central and Eastern Europe's accession into the European Union that we allowed freedom of movement in the way that virtually nobody else did. And that's when, in particular, as you already pointed out, immigration to the UK started to take off. We were told not many people would want to come. They did. The Polish plumbers become one of the stereotypes of British society, but it's had a long-term consequence, because the public were told one thing and something else happened.
A positive consequence. The British welfare state is reliant on this population. They're contributing to the welfare state. And indeed, for instance, the NHS is today in crisis because European citizens feel under pressure to leave.
All right, we're going to leave it there because the time has caught up with us, but so much more to say. Shoshana Fine, I want to thank you. I want to thank Alexis Poulain, John Curtis in London, Nick Dubois for being with us from Bishop's Stortford. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.